All right, moving into our last session for today. I think we're getting very close. As Justice Graber mentioned, the next person up is Chris Turner. Chris is the Director of Enforcement, Data, and Judicial Outreach with the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance. He's going to be talking to us about some best practices for citations and crash reporting. Chris is also a former Kansas Highway Patrol captain, where he oversaw the MICSAP program, weight enforcement, accident reconstruction teams, and the DRE and standardized field sobriety testing programs. And Chris is also a past president of CVSA. So with that, Chris, are you able to unmute yourself?
I am. Thank you so much for having me. Judge Graber, I was laughing. Well done. Holly and Dave, also an excellent job. I'm going to jump straight into the presentation with two things I want you to keep in the back of your mind as I talk about what our best practices and what our initiatives are. So Vladimir Zurkowski struck and killed 7 motorcycle riders in New Hampshire. He'd been charged the month before with operating under the influence and had refused a chemical test, a decision that ultimately should have cost him his license, but did not. Zurkowski had a long and fairly terrible driving history at 23 years old, to say the least. And without getting into all of the details, he should have been disqualified from driving for a couple of reasons. And you can see here in this crash that the NTSB also concluded that impairment was a probable cause or a factor in this crash. Next, we have the October 6th of 2018 limousine crash in New York, in which the driver, all 17 passengers and 2 pedestrians were killed as a 2001 stretch limousine was careening down the intersection of routes 30 and 30A in New York. It speeds up to 100 miles an hour, and the braking system failed. Ultimately, the investigation showed that the braking system was corroded and had been inadequately maintained and never upgraded from when they stretched the original limousine or the original vehicle into a limousine. Additionally, the driver of the limousine had failed to disclose medical ailments and prescriptions while undergoing his medical exam for his commercial driver's license. And he also failed to disclose that he was a habitual marijuana user, which should have prevented him from getting a license as well. So with that, I'm going to talk about the best practices for citations and crash reporting. And I'm not really going to go into the weeds of the training that we have, but I want to give you an overview of the efforts that CVSA is working on to accomplish these goals and what we're working towards. So thank you again for having me here today. I really appreciate you reaching out, Brenda, and giving us the opportunity to discuss these. So let's jump straight in. So first of all, if there are any folks out there who don't know who CVSA is, CVSA is the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance, and we are the jurisdictional representatives for all of Canada and her territories and provinces, the United States and her territories, and Mexico. We also have federal members of our alliance, FMCSA, NTSB, NHTSA, the DOT generally, PHMSA. And then we have industry. We have shippers, carriers, drivers, and technical experts who help make up our membership. And our number one priority is to save lives. And we do that through ensuring that inspections are done the same way. If you're in Kansas, where I am today in Topeka, that the inspection you receive here is the same or very nearly the same as the inspection that you would receive in Denver, where I think y'all are at today. And we want to make sure that that consistency is there, that the reciprocity is there, and that the inspections are the same across borders. And our goal is to improve safety and save lives. So first of all, let's talk about FMCSA and CVSA's goals. So our goal is to really further and enhance FMCSA's mission of one driver, one license, and one record. But really, it's much more than just enhancing it. For those of you that are aware, citations have gone down over time. There's probably lots of reasons for that we could get into the weeds with, but we want to make sure that those officers are completing traffic enforcement and that citations are written when they're appropriate and when they're applicable to the driver. And we want to ensure that these citations result in the appropriate conviction and that conviction ends up on the driver's record and is queryable primarily through SIDLIS or also through inlets. It's really the only way that we're going to get drivers who consistently make poor driving decisions or who have poor driving habits off our roadways until their driving behavior has been corrected. And then next, CVSA has our high priority grant, for a cooperative agreement involving post-crash data collection and MUC implementation. So first I'm going to talk about our CDLPI, which is the FMCSA Commercial Driver's License Program implementation. It's their grant program and provides financial assistance to the states to achieve compliance with FMCSA regulations concerning CDLs. But it also goes to other entities such as Judge Graber and the National Judicial College and CVSA. And so our goal is to educate officers and to work with prosecutors on the life cycle of a citation, really from the issuance of that citation through the prosecutor's office, through the court and the judiciary, and then back to the state driver's license agency, SDLA, so that it can reside on that driver's record and then be queryable to all of you roadside. So you have the complete history in front of you as you make those decisions on whether or not to write that citation. So we have two initiatives through this one cooperative agreement, and the initiatives are to train first MCSAP officers on the issuance of citations and best practices, and then also to train non-MCSAP or non-inspectors. And let's talk about inspectors first. So even inspectors don't always realize the critical importance of issuing motor vehicle citations to drivers. You know, often the thought is, or can be, and this is what I've heard from many folks out there as I teach, is that they don't want to write that driver one more ticket. They've already issued the violation. And now with CSA, you're supposed to write down every violation you come across to make sure the SMS scores stay equivalent and everything is recorded. And then you may also be issuing an out of service violation. Well, what's different with the commercial motor vehicle inspection? Well, if you think about it, you're building trust with that driver from the moment you stop them. So you approach the vehicle, you have to stand on a sideboard, potentially putting yourself in risk of being thrown into a traffic or a ditch. You're going to at some point stand in front of that commercial motor vehicle and give the driver directions and work cooperatively with them to check the vehicle components. You are going to get underneath that vehicle and check the brakes. And then you're going to have a conversation with the driver, interview the driver when you're checking to ensure that they're in compliance with the hours of service. But over that period of time, no matter how small, you've built a relationship with that driver. You have built trust. And it can be harder to issue that citation, knowing it may have a personal effect on that driver, his livelihood, his license, and his family. But that's one of the things that we have to overcome. We have to make sure that the inspectors know that their role and how critical their role is into writing that citation. They believe that the violation will still be on the carrier's record, that it could still be visible through the PSP. But as we've already discussed, the only real way to make sure that that driver does not continue those driving behaviors is make sure that those disqualifications that are listed in 49 CFR 38351 for the offenses you see on your screen now, that the driver's held accountable to those offenses and those convictions. And then the next step for CVSA will really be to focus on training local officers. And we have a couple new folks we've hired to help us do that, along with our current initiatives. And those are working on getting locals just to stop a commercial motor vehicle to begin with. CMV inspectors on post-crash initiatives, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then also here to get local officers involved and really the age-old problem of even stopping the commercial motor vehicle. There, the problem isn't that they built trust with the driver. When I worked midnights and I likely stopped an impaired driver on the side of the interstate or really anywhere, I can promise you I wasn't going to put myself in a position where they could push me into traffic with the door, certainly wasn't going to get in front of their vehicle, and obviously wasn't going to offer to check the brakes. So you don't have that same trust. You don't have the issue of whether or not they have that extra hesitation in writing the citation, but really what you have to overcome there is just getting the officer to stop that commercial motor vehicle in the first place. And then once we have that ensured, we need to make sure we focus on some of those best practices that we talked, or that Brenda said I was going to talk about. And those really are first issuing that citation and then doing the little things so that the court knows that they're dealing with a CDL driver. Of course, we train officers on masking and convictions, much like the National Judicial College works with judges and making sure they know what masking convictions are. And the National District Attorneys Association works hard to train prosecutors on masking and convictions. But they first need to know that they have a driver with a CDL. And at a very baseline level, that comes with marking that citation correctly as a CDL or as a commercial motor vehicle And with the CDL, it doesn't matter whether they're in a commercial motor vehicle or not, right? So we have to make sure we check that box. I remember, I'll confess on myself, I remember working the nights and checking my 50 trucks initially when I came on the patrol because I had to. And I was a young police officer and I wanted to arrest impaired drivers or whatever the goal was that evening. But generally, it wasn't to inspect a truck until I had some folks show me, and until I went to actually it's my first fatal I went to, and it was 470 from the Kansas to Missouri side, and a truck hauling potatoes had gone over the intercity viaduct and landed on the train tracks below. So that's when I realized how critical those inspections were. That was just as I was finishing up my training, but I also had to learn how important it was to properly fill out that citation, mark that CDL box, that CMV box, that hazardous materials box, or fill in the motor carrier information or DOT number if you have that on your citation. And so those are some of the best practices that we talk with states about and train officers to understand, and work with states that if they're going to be upgrading their citation, we understand you have limited resources and real estate on that piece of paper, but these are critically important boxes. As we all know, commercial motor vehicles are involved in a small percentage of crashes generally compared to the overall numbers, but a much more disproportionate number of the fatalities just because of their size for obvious reasons. The FMCSA really has thrown a lot of effort in this, and they work with the group that we call ourselves the Joint Court Partners, and that consists of CVSA and our constituency, which is the frontline officer, the National District Attorneys Association working with the courts, the National Judicial College and folks like Judge Graber educating the judiciary, and the National Center for State Courts, who work with states on making sure that they can get those convictions from the court reported to the state driver's license agency. We meet fairly often, at least every other month, and we make sure we work together. So just as an example, we've had judges and prosecutors reach out to the National District Attorneys Association, but it might be about the adoption of a specific reg or something that's not necessarily CDL related per se, but they need to understand, even if it is CDL related, need to understand how those regulations are adopted into their state or understand how FMCSA regulates this. And we take that opportunity to work with them to make sure they have that knowledge and understand what masking is. And the same thing for our constituency, the roadside officer needs to reach out to the National District Attorneys Association to get some information, or maybe just to have them reach out to the local traffic safety resource prosecutor or that prosecutor locally, just to have a visit with them about masking, what it is and how to avoid it, and whether or not they are engaging in it. And a lot of prosecutors that we've reached out to, the first thing they'll say is, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that I was masking. I didn't realize that this was against the law in my state or against federal regulation. And usually that takes care of it. Not much like Judge Graber. We certainly ran into the instance I did when I was with the patrol, and I have since, of prosecutors who want to be a little bit more maybe stubborn or with their interpretation of their state statutes. And we have to work a little harder to try and avoid that masking. So those are our efforts there on CDL and masking. We definitely have resources available to you for your download. I've provided some to Brenda for you to be able to download, such as NJC's bench card about what the major serious railway and out of service violations are. Feel free to download that. And if you're a member of CVSA, you can log on to your account, go to CVSA Learn. Once you log in, go to our Learning tab, and it'll take you to our LMS, where you can download many of these materials, as well as see much more information under the CDL tab. Because this is sponsored by FMCSA, it's free to anyone. So if anyone else would like access to that, please just email me, and my contact information will be at the end of the presentation. We can get you access to these materials or our partners' materials. Now let's talk about our high priority cooperative agreement for crashes. So CVSA has really long known that we need to be involved in crashes and post-crash data collection and have that be standardized. And recently, about 2 years ago, when they hired me, was to work on this initiative as well as the CDLPI, and both of them have taken off. And we've had tremendous partnership with FMCSA and others regarding both of these initiatives, and we're grateful to them. And thank you, the FMCSA folks who are on the line for these efforts. So realizing that, we actually had to grow CVSA a little bit, and we recently hired Terry Coomer away from Kansas as he retired to move on to his second career with us, and he's working diligently on these efforts now. but I will go through them with you. So we want to establish and maintain a uniform commercial motor vehicle crash reporting, focusing on MUC standards and best practices. What does that mean? Well, we need to make sure that we have some sort of standardized data set that we want to collect after a crash occurs. We really want to start with the MUC standards as a minimum baseline for that data collection, but understanding that the MUC standards are really the minimum that we want to collect. We want to go further than the MUC standards, and we need to have flexibility within our crash data collection to, on the fly, be able to collect different information, which is critical to us. Some things that have recently come up over the last year and a half are rear impact guards and whether or not that should be an out of service. We don't have the data, or didn't have the data to be able to make a decision on whether that should be in the out of service criteria, and no great mechanism to collect it. So I think it was about a year and a half ago, we had a one-day enforcement. Well, what we need is to have something where we can quickly put different data sets up that we need to collect and collect those consistently within a standardized way. So that's one of our goals. Our next goal is to establish and maintain a uniform commercial motor vehicle post-crash investigation protocol, focusing on commercial motor vehicle and driver identification, all the SSDQ data points. So as we talk about this one, what we're really speaking to here is we need a standardized criteria really for when you're going to respond to the CMV post-crash, at what level you're going to respond to it. When does a MCSAP certified inspector go? When does a crash reconstructionist respond to the scene? What about a DRE to check for impairment, or somebody who's been through a ride, in conjunction with the standardized data that we want them to collect? And we do still need to focus on those SSDQ, the state safety data measurements, to make sure that those are in line. Just like regular data queues, where most of them are incorrect. I think it's something like 50% of the data queues are the incorrect carrier identification. It's really similar on the crashes. We need to make sure that we can properly identify those motor carriers. Next, we want to establish and maintain a uniform commercial motor vehicle post-crash training. Now, really, this is going to be two trainings. So as I talk about this in the next bullet, keep in mind that there's two that we're working towards. First is the commercial motor vehicle post-crash training. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the next bullet and explain them both together. So we're talking about two things here. The first is we want to establish post-crash accredited training through CSA, much like your North American Standard, your NAS, level 1 inspection course. And this would be additional training. It's not to make you an accident reconstructionist, but really it's to help gather the critical data and information points that we don't normally see, whether it's the rear impact guard or maybe the 7 drug categories, or some other critical piece of information that we need to uncover to make sure that FMCSA can make those good decisions regarding improvements to regulations, or we can make improvements to our out of service criteria, but we need to be able to make good decisions based on solid data. So we want to have that as an addition to our level 1 course. And then after that, we want to begin focusing on another course, which I'll call it a tweener course as an example, but it's going to be for the regular roadside officer to really help combat the second bit of information, which is making sure they know what to collect at a baseline level. And this is one of the things that Scott Valentine and his group brought up at our last conference. And that's that while states roughly account for 50% of all the data, maybe a little bit more, of CMV crashes that are reported, that's primarily on fatal crashes from MCSAP lead agencies. In many states, local jurisdictions provide the lion's share of crash data, and those are going to be on your minor injury crashes or your property damage crashes. And that's data that we really need. If we look and there's 400,000 commercial motor vehicle crashes in a year, only 5,000 of them are fatals. 5,000 is a great sample size, but it's really disproportionate to the actual data that we need to collect. And we need to have consistent data on those injury crashes as well as the property damage crashes. And we need it to be accurate, and we need regular officers, much like we need them to stop a commercial motor vehicle and issue a ticket to the driver for poor driving behavior. We need to properly collect this post-crash data. So that's the two-prong approach we're taking underneath this cooperative agreement with FMCSA. And then finally, much like our commercial driver's license being on our learning management system, our intent as we move forward is to have another learning management system section where we have this post-crash reporting best practices. We have the MUC standards and best practices for adoption, and the post-crash training where we can provide courses and snippets and accredited through our CVSA LMS. So those are our efforts, both on the CDL side as well as on the crash side. Overall, ultimately, our goal is to save lives, and that's what we're working towards every day. And with that, I'm happy to stand for questions.
Great, thank you, Chris. Once again, lots of great information there. Do we have any questions for Chris? So Chris, one thing I was wondering, what would you say in terms of the CDL side would be the most important takeaway, like training takeaway for law enforcement?
I'd say there's really two that are at the top. The first is that we need to make sure we stop the commercial motor vehicle, whether it's a mix-app officer or a local officer who's not certified, and take the appropriate action for those driving behaviors, whether it's speeding greater than 15 over, really any speed in a CMV, but greater than 15 over, failing to use your turn signal, just the regular rules of road that apply in every state. But then once we've taken that step, it is so critical that we issue that citation. We're talking about professional drivers. They understand the rules. Often they understand the rules better than many of the officers who stop them. They've been driving for a long period of time. They understand what violations take away from their CDL. And it's one of the things they do when they go to court. They plead their case about how this will affect their family. And that's one of the ways they can manipulate the situation to their benefit. So we need to stop the vehicle and we need to make sure we issue that citation. And those are the two most critical things on the CDL side.
Thank you, that makes sense. Anyone think of a question for Chris? Come on, somebody wants to stand up and ask something, right?
Everyone's in a hurry to get to their wonderful reception you have planned, I'm sure.
We are looking forward to that. But I guess one more quick question for you. Just in terms of the crash reporting side, do you have a good example of data CBSA wants to collect that's not a MUC standard now?
So let's take the 7 drug categories as an example. So we want to make sure, most crash reports talk about was the driver impaired by a substance or was that substance present, but it doesn't go nearly far enough. My last 3 DREs I did just before I left the patrol were all PCP related here in Topeka, Kansas. That may or may not be what you'd think would be in Topeka. I have no idea, but we can't make good staffing decisions for where we should put our DREs or who should be trained in ARIDE if we don't collect that data. And if we're talking about mechanical data, I'll fall back to the crash guard as the example. When you have interested parties in Congress and tragic events where someone's lost a family member, they can exert a lot of pressure. And that's what happened to us. We got letters from Senator Rubio and the other senators escaping me, but asking us to put it in our out of service criteria. And we really need that data to be able to understand whether or not we can make those good decisions. Like everyone else, when FMCSA promulgates a regulation or has their notice of rulemaking, they need data to make those good decisions. And the same way, the states need to be able to have that data to allocate their resources effectively to reduce crashes, whether it's funding for a certain type of equipment or making sure they have personnel in the right locations to combat what they need to work on. They can't do that without that data collection, and we need to increase those data points as effectively and as quickly as we can.
Great, thanks, Chris. Appreciate that. Dustin, just to check, is there any comments online?
I am not showing any.
Great. Anyone come up with a question for Chris? All right, I think you're off the hook, Chris.
Thank you so much. I really am grateful for the opportunity. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person, and I hope you have a great rest of the conference.
Thank you. We appreciate that.